I have been a dungeon master since the early 1980s. I originally started playing Basic Expert and then switched to Advanced D&D and played that for many years. And then lately, since about 2016, I've been playing 5th edition, including the 2014 and 2024 releases. During that time, I've helped various people become dungeon masters themselves or find out if they're really right for being a dungeon master, just based on their own preferences. I reached out to people on social media and followers and so forth and asked them, what questions do you have as someone who is curious about becoming a dungeon master? Or if you're new to being a dungeon master, what questions do you have to become a better one? So this is my 20 questions for a dungeon master. Let's get started. The first question is, what's the difference between being a player and a dungeon master? Obviously, this is for someone who's never played D&D before or been a dungeon master and so forth, but I'm going to answer this question from the perspective of how you work with the game and how you play. A dungeon master is the one who acts as the referee, and they control the game in the sense that they tell you what you see, you tell them what you do, and then they tell you the result. Essentially, that's all that Dungeons & Dragons boils down to, is those three things. As the player, you're the one who hears what the dungeon master describes as what you see, hear, experience, and so forth. You then make a decision using information based on your character sheet and say, this is what we're going to do, or this is what we're going to attempt. And then the dungeon master tells you how that works out. Obviously, you use dice and things like that to determine results. It's not just entirely up to the dungeon master, but that's essentially the difference. The dungeon master is the referee, and they also are generally the creator of what you're experiencing. They plan ahead of time all the stuff that's happening in this fantasy world, and then you move around within it and they tell you, what the results are, what you see, and so forth. So they're the creator and the referee at the same time. You're the one that gets to explore all that and so forth. So that's essentially the difference between being a player and a dungeon master in terms of what you do. The second question is being a dungeon master hard? That all depends. Being hard is a matter of subjective opinion. I will say that it's got a lot of work. There's a lot involved in being a dungeon master. So in that sense, it can be difficult. It can be hard, especially if you're not the kind of person who likes to spend a lot of time in the background away from the table doing things. You'd rather just be at the table playing. In that sense, being a dungeon master absolutely would be hard because there can be a lot of prep. There can be improv. So if you are very uncomfortable with doing improvisation and so forth and changing things on the fly, that can also be a challenge. And if you don't handle multiple things happening all at once, then running the game can be difficult. Because if you're a dungeon master and you've got 4 players, they're doing a lot of things at the same time. They're telling you what they do. You have to keep track of what they're doing. You have to keep track of what monsters and so forth are doing, what NPCs are doing. And you have to keep track of where they are in the world and how their actions are impacting the world around them. So in that sense, it's hard as well. So I don't want to intimidate you into thinking that being a DM is hard so that you don't bother to try. But I will say absolutely that it is a labor of love. If you don't love it, it will be nothing but labor. If you do love it, then the labor will be part of the joy. I personally take a great deal of pleasure in the preparation side of being a DM. And I love the dynamic aspect of running the game at the table because you never know what's going to happen. So it is a lot of work, but it's also a lot of fun. Okay, my third question is, what's required to be a DM in terms of stuff? This is, what kind of things do you have to own or possess or use to be a dungeon master? A lot of people would say the first thing would be a dungeon master's guide. And I don't necessarily think that's true. You can usually play the game quite adequately without a dungeon master's guide. And once you become a dungeon master, at least in my experience, I have found that I actually reference the DMG very rarely. I almost always reference the player's handbook way more often and the monster manual. So once you kind of get into the swing of things, you really don't need a dungeon master's guide. It's got a lot of stuff in there, especially for weapons and treasure and those kinds of things. But I don't know, it's just not one of those things that's required. One of the other things that usually is required is a Dungeon Master screen. That's that panel that goes between the DM and the rest of the party so that you can keep what you're doing behind the screen private. There's various things that you need to have, your notes and all that kind of stuff. And of course, you need to have written materials. You need to make a bunch of notes about what your dungeon contains, what the adventure contains, what your NPCs are like, what monsters you're going to use, and so forth. So a notepad, pencil, those kinds of things, and some dice, of course. But really, other than that, you don't have to have much of anything at all. I have run games using no materials, no references or anything, just purely my own imagination and my own knowledge of what's in the game. So it can be that that flexible and that easy and free going. So it's all up to you. Okay, fourth question. How much time does it take to prepare an adventure? This all depends. There are some DMs that I have seen spend 15 minutes prior to a game session just kind of mentally preparing in their brain what they're going to do. I have done that myself from time to time, especially if it's an ongoing campaign and I'm already familiar with where everybody is. There are other times where you can be the opposite. You can spend hours and hours of prep time prior to playing the game. And I used to be one of those kinds of dungeon masters. I loved it, so it wasn't a burden, but I did prep a great deal. In fact, I one time estimated that I was spending anywhere from 10 to 15 hours of prep for every 1 hour of game time. That was way too much. I, over time, learned that I didn't need to do that, but it was still a labor of love. I love doing that. So preparation can be a joy all on its own. And there are some DMs that just do nothing but create dungeons that they never actually play. It's entirely up to you. So there is no hard or fast answer to this. The only thing that I think would be required is you at least have to have in your mind an idea of where everybody currently is and what's going to happen next, most likely. The players may choose to go off in some new direction you did not anticipate, and you cannot anticipate every place they might go. So don't over-prep in that sense. You don't have to be prepared for every possible contingency, as long as you have enough flexibility and improv skills to be able to just kind of go with it and make it up as you go along. That is something that doesn't necessarily require a great deal of skill, but it does require a certain amount of confidence, and that comes about with just doing it. After a while, you learn that you need a lot less prep than you thought you did. But if you want to do a lot of prep, go for it. Okay, our fifth question, how can you be a DM if you don't have a lot of free time? That's a really good question, and I've probably seen more dungeon masters stop playing D&D because they just didn't have enough free time for the level of preparation and so forth that they really wanted to put into it. It is challenging, and like I said, being a DM requires off-hours time. Being a player doesn't. The only thing you have to do off-hours as a player is, roll up a character, maybe write up a backstory, and that's about it. Once play starts, you don't have to do anything. You just show up. So being a DM, you have to love the stuff that's off hours. If you don't have a lot of free time, I wouldn't necessarily recommend becoming a dungeon master. But if you really love it, then sometimes those few hours that you spend a week or however much time you spend can be your sanctuary away from the real world. And it's one of those things where, yeah, it does take up a certain amount of hours, but it's crucial that you do. That's all a matter of personal perspective and preference and so forth. But if you don't have a lot of free time, generally being a dungeon master is not the greatest pursuit. You can't just drop in and do it unless you're really good at improv and enjoy that. But give it a try and see how it works. You may find that you would rather be a dungeon master in your off-hour time than something else. So you give up something else instead of, so that you've got more time to be a DM. But yes, it does take a fair bit of time. Question 6. I can't do voices. Can I still be a good DM? A lot of people think that you have to be able to portray all kinds of different characters, speaking different voices and all that kind of stuff. Not that there's rednecks in D&D, but anyway, you don't have to be able to do voices at all. You don't have to portray as an actor other characters if you don't want to. That's just a matter of personal flair and preference. It's no different than players or DMs showing up in costume. That's something that you can do if you want. It's fun if it's for you. It's entirely for you. So if you're a DM and you can't do voices or whatever, don't sweat it. Most DMs can't or don't do it very well. In fact, a lot of people around a D&D table really aren't that good at it, but it doesn't matter. As long as you're having fun, That's what matters. Okay, our seventh question. Can you be a dungeon master and be a player too? Absolutely, and this happens all the time. I used to be in a group back in 2018, 2019, where myself and another individual would take turns. One would be the dungeon master for a month to 3 months, kind of until their part of the campaign resolved itself. And then they would take a break and then I would take over. And we did this in the same world, so there was continuity, and we only exchanged certain notes so that we maintained that continuity, but otherwise it was our campaign. So there's a lot of DMs who will run a game with one group and be a player in another. It's all a matter of how much time you have available and so forth. But most DMs would rather be able to play when they want to as well. So it's very common for them to be both. Okay, now we're on to question 8. Why are DMs in such short supply? The answer to this question is probably implicitly embedded in many of the answers I've already given so far. It's because there's a lot of prep and time commitment for the most part. So a lot of dungeon masters or people who want to become dungeon masters become intimidated by that time constraint, so much so that they don't even try in the first place. So let me be clear about something. Being a DM really is no different than being a player in terms of it's just something that you do because you enjoy the experience. Yes, there's a bit more of a burden on a dungeon master than to be a player. You don't just show up and play the game and then go home and be done. There's no homework essentially. But as a dungeon master, you do have things that you do off hours. And as long as you enjoy that, then there's no burden at all. I think that's probably why there are fewer dungeon masters than there are players. And this is just a guess, I would say for every one dungeon master, there's 20 players, or to look at it another way, for every 20 players, there's one dungeon master. And because of that, there's this perception that there aren't a lot of dungeon masters, and I do think that's true. There are fewer dungeon masters because of that burden of time and so forth. And it's gotten to the point where there's national attention about the lack of dungeon masters. So it can be a challenge. I mean, you have to deal with a lot of different people. As players have different personalities, just like dungeon masters have different personalities and so forth. So there are some challenges to it, but it's one of those things that if it's something you enjoy, absolutely pursue it. We definitely need more dungeon masters. Question 9 is, what is a forever DM? This kind of goes to the previous question. A forever DM is someone who is the dungeon master, but they wish they could be a player as well, but because nobody else is volunteering to be a DM, they never get to be a player. That's kind of how that happens. It's usually a situation you get stuck in because people find out that you're a DM and that you're good at it and you're willing to do it. They keep showing up to your games, but nobody else volunteers to be a DM themselves. So one of the ways to get out of that is to just say, I'm not going to DM for the next 2 months. I need a break. Somebody else want to take over. Tell them it's temporary, and that helps. But unfortunately, yeah, there's a lot of people who are dungeon masters who get stuck in that because nobody else will volunteer to be a DM themselves. Okay, we're halfway through. Question 10. I want to be a DM but don't know any players. How do I form a group? This is kind of the opposite of what happens when you're a forever DM. So you want to play D&D, you've decided to become a dungeon master, you've read up about it, maybe you've done it a little bit, but you're having a hard time finding players. Typically, this is the easier problem to solve. The harder problem is when you're a group of players and you can't find someone to be the DM. But what I have done is when I'm looking for a group is I ask around. I talk to coworkers, I talk to my friends. If you belong to any kind of social group, just ask and say, do you play D&D and want to play in a group that I'm going to form? Or have you ever played D&D at all? And if not, do you want to start playing? It helps to offer a session for people who have never played before and make it nice and easy for them, no pressure, walk them through the process with as little over-explaining as possible. But another thing that I've done is I've literally put up paper flyers on bulletin boards around town, at the grocery store, at the coffee shops, and so forth. And a lot of these places are super happy to let you put up a flyer and so forth. I currently run the teens D&D group through my local public library, and that's how I got players for that. It didn't take long either. I put up flyers at the grocery stores, a couple of coffee shops, put a flyer at the library itself, and before you knew it, I had all kinds of players, reaching out to me saying, "Hey, I want to play." The library itself has been fantastic at getting players because I use their community room. They are very happy to bring in people from the public to play the game because it's a service that they can provide to the public. I'm not paid. So I'm doing this for free. They're giving me the facility. They're doing all their advertising for me in their newsletter and so forth, not only on their website, but in their printed newsletter that goes out to every homeowner. So I actually have a waiting list any moment from 2 to 5 players eager to get in. And as players, leave because of schedule conflict and so forth, a spot opens up and new players come in. So just it's not much different than anything else. You just reach out to others that maybe post to social media, be specific about your location. One thing I do recommend is you meet with your players first to get a sense for what their expectations are, what their experience level is, and just kind of find out if you're going to get along, because you do have to all get along to some degree to form a good group that stays consistent. But yeah, just reach out with community organizations, your local community action center, those kinds of things, and post up flyers. That's what I did, and it worked really well. Okay, question 11. I'm a player now, and our dungeon master just quit. Should I take over? Absolutely. There's a lot of groups that will stop running because the DM leaves or has a schedule conflict or something like that. So it's not uncommon for one of the players to step up and say, "I'll do it." Especially if they've witnessed how the other DM ran the game and so forth. They have a pretty good idea of what to expect and so forth. Sometimes the DM that's leaving will just hand over their campaign and say, "Here's all my notes. Here's where things are going. Take over." Or it's the player's turn to volunteer and say, "Hey, DM, would you like a break? I'd be happy to DM for a little while to see how it is or to, see if I enjoy doing that and so forth." A lot of DMs are eager to let others take over for a week or two or a month or two just to get them a break and so forth. So if your DM quits or leaves or something like that, it's absolutely appropriate and welcomed if you raise your hand and say, "I'll give it a try." And then maybe if you don't like it after a week or two, be honest with everybody else and pass the baton. Maybe all your players take a turn being a DM for a week each, and then rotate back around. It's entirely up to you, but absolutely should you volunteer if you're willing to do it. Okay, question 12. I'm a new DM and I'm afraid of not being adequately prepared. How do I know if I've prepped enough? This is probably one of what I see as the biggest fears of new dungeon masters is not being prepared. And this comes from lack of confidence and lack of exposure. The confidence comes from time. When you've been a DM long enough and for enough players, you realize that you have probably better make it up as you go along skills than you thought. And then also as you've run various people through adventures and encounters and so forth, you can rely on your past experience to come up with variations on the fly that are new to the players before you. And you can handle that kind of thing. And over time, I have learned in my own experience that I have always, always, always prepped more than I needed. So if you're a new DM and you're fearful about not being overprepared, try to remind yourself that preparation beyond a certain level is unnecessary. It's just extra time. If you love doing that, go for it, but it's not necessarily a requirement. A lot of times, really all you need to do is have a monster manual handy so that you can reference monster stats, a list of fictional names that are handy. Usually you keep them on the inside of your DM screen so that if the players run across an NPC you haven't prepared for, you can just kind of look at your little cheat sheet, come up with a name off the top of your head, and they think you had it planned all along. The biggest trick is whatever happens, act as if it was intended or act if it was planned, or just say, let's let the dice decide, and then while they're rolling their dice, you're kind of making up in your mind the options of where things can go. So this is something that I can tell you kind of in an abstract way that you don't need to prepare as much as you think you do. But it's one of those things you're emotionally not going to grasp until you've run enough D&D games and sessions to realize that you really don't have to prep as much as you think you do. Okay, lucky 13. Improvisation scares me. Can I still be a good DM if I'm not very good at improv? Absolutely. Improv is a very useful tool to have when you're a dungeon master, probably way more than if as a player. But if you can't improv very well, don't worry about it too much. A lot of times improv comes in the form of thinking of what an NPC is going to say in real time based on what the players are saying or doing. Improv is kind of that outward, as an actor, how you speak, what you say, what you do kind of in the fly or, on the fly. And that is something that is a skill, not necessarily a talent, at least in my observation. And I say that some people are just naturally good at it, which I guess would be a talent, but improv is something that can be learned. And as you run D&D games often enough and frequently enough, you will learn that improv becomes a lot easier. You can just go slow. You can kind of stall a little bit while you think about what can be said. You can rely on dice. There's a lot of charts and tables that if a player runs across an NPC, you can roll for reactions. And you roll a dice and look at a list and say, they respond with an arrogant tone. I mean, that can be the extent of your improv. You don't have to act like you're arrogant and so forth. You can just say, I'm going to roll and see how that NPC responds, and then look at the chart and just tell the players that NPC acts arrogant, like they're better than you. And that's all you have to do, really. The players, theater of the mind, they figure it out and move on. It's not like players are going to say, I'm leaving that group because that DM can't improv very well. I've never witnessed that or experienced that or heard of anyone saying that. So if a player is willing to leave your group because you can't improv very well, you probably don't want that player in your group. Well, that might be a little harsh, but don't worry about it. If you don't know how to improv very well, or if it scares you, there's tons of ways to run a D&D game without improv at all. Okay, question 14. What is railroading? Why is it bad, and how do I avoid it? Railroading is when you keep funneling the players into a pre-designated outcome regardless of their choices. You know how a train can't deviate off the tracks? It has to go where the tracks are already laid. Well, that's kind of what happens in railroading in D&D. The dungeon master has already pre-decided everything that's going to happen and the way things are going to turn out. And if the players get presented with a choice of door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3, no matter which door they choose, they're always going to go to the same destination on the other side. That's railroading. Now, the reason why it's bad is because part of the joy and the benefit of playing D&D as a player is being able to choose your own adventure, in the sense that your choices are up to you. They call that player agency. And when you take away someone's sense of agency, they're just passengers. They're not really participating in the game the way the game was designed. So when a dungeon master pre-plans a session or an adventure or an entire campaign so that everything comes out in the way that they planned, that's railroading, and players will get bored. And if you're a DM and that's really what you keep trying to do, consciously or unconsciously, try writing fantasy fiction instead. That way you have complete and total control over the characters and the settings and the action and what happens to them and so forth, without worrying about upsetting other people or taking away their sense of agency. They will gladly read your fiction and so forth, understanding that that's what's going to happen. So railroading is very much a bad thing in my opinion. There are shades of gray on that, because there are certain circumstances where the DM wants things to happen, but there's creative ways to do that so that the players still have a choice. But sometimes you can just let them know, when you guys go through that door, this is what's going to happen. And they understand that that's pertinent to the situation itself, not the entire campaign. Otherwise, it's not really D&D. They're just listening to your fiction. Okay, question 15. What is a sandbox campaign, and how do I prepare for one? A sandbox is essentially the exact opposite of railroading. A sandbox is a place, a world, where the players can go wherever they want They can interact with whatever they choose and so forth. And then the DM just sort of says, okay, you made that choice. You went here. You said this. You did this. Here's the result. And they don't pre-plan pretty much anything about where the party's going to go, what the campaign is, and so forth. This can kind of freak out a DM that isn't comfortable with taking things on the fly, like improv and so forth. If you are the kind of DM that feels like you have to be exceptionally prepared, there's some pros and cons here to a sandbox campaign. The trick is you can prepare what's in the world, just don't prepare what happens. And the difference is if you've got this very broad and deep world with tons of stuff in it and tons of people and monsters and all kinds of potential, that's the word, is potential. That can be an absolute joy. I've done that before. I've created a sandbox world where it just had tons of stuff in it, just eagerly waiting for the players to discover it. But you don't plan what will happen or the sequence of events and so forth. You don't know where the players are going to go, what they're going to choose to pay attention to, what they're going to ignore, and so forth. So you have to be, you don't have to, but it helps if you are prepared for what's there, or at least have random tables and so forth to generate things on the fly if they go in a completely unexpected direction. But don't prepare the sequence or the events or the plot hooks and those kinds of things. They can exist to be discovered, but don't force the players into doing that. So sandboxing is one of those things where it also helps for the players to know that they are in a sandbox campaign and that you may not have everything absolutely thoroughly 100% generated ahead of time. Sometimes if you're running a sandbox campaign, you ask your players, tell me where you're going to go during the next session. You know, at the end of this session, they declare, okay, we're going to go north and explore that town that we saw on the map. Great, that's what you're going to do. So then you can prepare more detail for that town before the next session. That really helps a lot. If you leave it up to the players to just randomly decide what they're going to do at the moment, you have to be a lot more flexible on your feet as a DM to handle that. 16. Where do DMs get their ideas? We buy them at Walmart. Actually, I've done several videos where I talk about how to find your muse and where to get ideas and this kind of stuff. It's you know, creativity is one of those things where I always say it's easier to edit than to create. So my biggest advice is to take things in the real world, use them as a foundation for your idea, and then put the fantasy flair on top of that. Or take people's personalities and base your NPCs on those individuals that, you know, may exist in real life and so forth. So it's easier to just take things that are around you and turn them into a fantasy idea. The other thing is to rely on your Dungeon Master's guides. This is where they really pay off. So the vast majority of them have sections that talk about how to create an adventure. And they will have, you know, 10 categories of adventure ideas. I've done a video on that. That's a really good watch, by the way, if you want to get 3 adventure ideas per 10 category. I've got 2 different videos already, 30 adventure ideas and then 30 more adventure ideas. So take these things and use them as inspiration. There's an old saying that all rock and roll is just ripped off blues chords. Well, there's a lot of truth to that, especially in D&D. A lot of D&D adventures are derivative in one way or another of other ideas that are extended or changed in some manner. So most DMs don't just grab an idea out of thin air. Some do, and sometimes I've had to do that, but it's even in the back of your brain, they're still based usually on real life experiences or past dungeon adventures and so forth with a different group. So DMs really do, they steal a lot, but that's okay as long as it's new to you, it's still new. Okay, question 17. How much prep is too much prep? This is going to be determined by you and no one else. I can say that for some people, 15 minutes before a session is more than enough. Other people, 15 hours before a session would feel nerve-wracking, like they're nowhere near prepared enough. It's entirely up to you. If you enjoy prep, then do as much prep as you wish. I like prep, and I actually enjoy creating massive levels of detail, but it's overwhelmingly not necessary at the gaming table. I rarely use all of it. In fact, I would say usually I only use about 30% of what I've prepped. That's kind of my average. Now, how you determine if a certain amount of prep is too much is probably when it becomes a burden. When you feel like you're dreading it, or when you feel like you're having to give up other things that you don't want to give up because you've got all this prep, essentially when it feels like unwanted homework, that's when it's too much prep. Now, you also want to ask the question, how little prep is not enough? Did I phrase that right? If you are finding that you're at the D&D table and the players are going places that you're not equipped to handle on the fly, or they're asking questions about deep campaign hooks that you haven't thought of before, you might want to prep a little bit more so that you've got those ideas at least in your head, if not jotted down. And here's one little trick about memory. If you think of an idea and it's in your brain, it has a certain amount of value. If you think of that idea and then write that idea down prior to the game, it will add to the weight and solidity in your mind. You will remember it better by doing that because you've now utilized two parts of your intellectual capability to produce that idea or to record that idea. So you'll remember it a little better. So that's where writing down your ideas and your notes and stuff gives you some benefit so that when you actually play, you're going to recall it better. Now, everyone's different, but again, too much prep is when it feels like a burden and you dread it. Too little prep is when you're finding out that you're just not prepared enough at the game table. Okay, question 18. What goes on behind a DM screen? That's entirely up to the DM, but usually they will have a notepad and a pencil so they can write stuff down as they go. We have to keep track of how many hit points a monster has. If we come up with a name for an NPC on the fly, we'll jot that down. I like to write down the race, class, and level and name of all the characters at the table so that I can keep track because I can't always remember the name of the paladin or the bard and so forth. And then I write down brief notes of key events in the session because after the session, I will then type up session notes that I can refer to before the next session so that I can get refreshed on what transpired during the previous session. If you are one of those DMs that runs multiple groups, this is absolutely essential. You don't want to tell Group A, the dragon was only half dead when you visited it last, when you're actually playing with Group B and they're fighting skeletons and they've never even encountered a dragon. So you don't want to get those kinds of things screwed up. But also behind a DM screen, we will keep notes about monster stats. We know what their armor class is, how many hit points they have, and so forth. We might have notes about what's coming up, but we usually, if we're preparing or if we're running a prepared campaign, whether it's our own or a store-bought or something like that, we will have those references, those notes of what's in that dungeon, what room they're in, these kinds of things. That's where all that prep comes into play. How that's organized is entirely up to the DM and how they work. Sometimes it's all just a bunch of handwritten notes on pieces of paper. Other times it's formal booklets that they've prepared and printed out. I've seen dungeon masters take 3-ring binders that are 3 inches thick with all of their notes and so forth. That level of preparation kind of scares me a little bit, but it also kind of thrills me because generating that is a lot of fun. I just like that. But whatever it is behind the DM screen, it's usually something that is useful to that particular DM and may not necessarily be the best method or material for you if you're a dungeon master. So ultimately, you got to figure out what do you need behind the screen that helps you run the game in real time. Okay, question 19, the penultimate question. Ooh, and this is a good one. Should I fudge dice rolls? So first of all, fudging dice rolls is when a DM rolls a dice behind the screen where you can't see it. And let's say the dice says that the monster hits. But based on the way the game is going, you know that if the monster succeeds in their attack, that the player is likely going to die. And you don't want that to happen. So you will fudge and lie and say, oop, the monster missed. You've been saved for another round. That's fudging dice rolls. You cannot fudge dice rolls in the open, obviously. So if a DM is always rolling their dice behind the screen, they have that capability of fudging dice rolls. Now, whether you should or should not fudge dice rolls is entirely a subjective thing. There is no hard and fast rule that says every time you fudge a dice roll, an angel loses its wings. And it doesn't work that way. There are absolutely times when it's valuable for a DM to fudge a dice roll. And that usually is where there's a significant emotional impact to the adventure, to the session, or even to the entire campaign. And they want to do that. Sometimes you may have a player that shows up to the session and you can tell that they've had a really bad day. And they are emotionally not prepared for a lot of bad dice rolls. I've run into that situation once before, and you kind of emotionally want that player to have a better experience, so you fudge a couple of dice rolls just to make sure that things don't go completely south. If you fudge dice rolls, don't let them know you're fudging dice rolls. That's kind of the key. I used to do that. I used to fudge dice rolls a little too often. Now I roll everything out in the open unless it's one of those dice rolls that has to be behind the screen, like if a player is trying to be stealthy. They don't get to see that dice roll. There's a functional reason why they don't get to see that. As the DM, you tell them you move across the room in the shadows, and as far as you know, you've not been spotted. But you know, because of the dice roll, that they actually have been spotted. That's something where you don't want the player to know the result of that dice roll. That's not fudging. That's something that actually serves the game in a functional way. So fudging dice rolls is one of those subjective things that's entirely up to the DM. I recommend that if you are the DM where you're going to roll out in front of everybody, that they be prepared to accept the consequences of whatever the dice do. It's just kind of a fairness sort of thing. But that's my own personal opinion and perspective. Okay, we're down to our last question, number 20. How do you plan a balanced encounter? It helps to understand the strengths and weaknesses and current status of the party. You want to know if your party is at full health. They've got all their spells, all their missile weapons and so forth. They've got a bunch of healing potions and so forth. You also want to know if they have greatly reduced hit points, their spell slots are all used up, they don't have any healing potions and so forth, or they're overly encumbered because they've got a ton of stuff that they're carrying and so forth. So you want to make sure that your encounters are dynamically adjusted based on the circumstance. This is kind of like fudging dice rolls, but it's the DM's discretion, and this is where judicious understanding of how things are going in the dynamic experience of the game as it's playing really plays out. So, for example, let's say you've got a party who's roughly at half health, and they encounter a group of monsters, and you've pre-planned that there's going to be 6 monsters, 1 per party member. But the party is weakened, they don't have any healing left over, they don't have any area of effect spells and so forth. So what you do is, instead of fudging attack rolls with the monsters, you decide at the beginning of the combat that they're only going to face 4 of the monsters instead of 6. It's better to do that than it is to artificially reduce the effectiveness or health of the monsters themselves. This goes in the other direction. If the party is doing really well and they're proving that they are punching above their weight against the monsters, and let's say they've blown through other monsters before without getting any damage themselves, in their next encounter, you may actually make it more difficult by having more monsters or more diverse monsters, or add an additional more difficult monster to the encounter. Now, if you find that during the combat itself, during the encounter, that things are just going completely south, you can do a couple different things. First of all, if the dice are just being unkind, that happens. Sometimes failed dice rolls can be more memorable and talked about with fondness after the fact than when things are just everybody's rolling nat 20s. So if you want to adjust things during the encounter itself, you can introduce other elements. So for example, if you have a combat that is going really badly for the party, and you really don't want the party to get wiped out, a TPK, total party kill, you can introduce other elements that perhaps some other monster that is equally antagonistic to the first monsters enters the arena and scares off half of the first group and then leaves. You can do all kinds of things like that so that there is some plausible reason for the combat to change in a new direction. That way you're not just fudging dice rolls, you're not arbitrarily, Deus Machina, having some god come down from on high and smiting the monsters that, the party can't beat. Now, again, there's a lot of judicious judgment that goes on with the dungeon master. And the thing is, you have to always remember is you want this to be a fun experience. That doesn't mean it has to be an easy experience. But if the players have been making nothing but poor choices, even with evidence that their choice was going to be a poor one, and they're just being jerks inside the dungeon, for the session, let the dice fall where they may. If they make a bunch of poor choices, then let the results of those choices manifest. If they've been making nothing but great choices, but the dice are unkind, sometimes you can just let the dice be unkind and they'll know that, especially if you're rolling the dice out in the open. That way, they're not blaming you how it goes. They just, we just had a terrible night with dice rolls, or the monsters were on fire. It all depends. So it's one of those things where if you want to plan a balanced encounter, you can look at the challenge rating of the monsters, try to match that to the party itself. So if you've got a party of 4 adventurers and they're all 4th level, you probably want to see our 4 monster to face them. That's kind of how that works. That's a ballpark. But be willing and able to change things dynamically if you feel that's necessary and wise. Okay, so that has been 20 questions that were submitted to me by people online and a couple of friends of mine who were looking at getting into D&D. I hope that has helped you out. This is all based on my own personal experience. I've been a DM for over 40 years. I'm not a great DM. I've been one for a while. I've had a lot of things that I've had to learn how to do kind of the hard way. Back when I started, I never had this kind of resource available where I could ask a DM, hey, what's the best way to do this? And how did you learn how to do this and so forth? So I hope this helps you out. If it inspires you to become a DM, I absolutely encourage you to give it a try. That's the only way to know for sure. If you know an existing DM, ask if you can kind of sit in behind the DM screen with them for a couple of sessions and ask questions later. That's one of the best ways I've seen anybody teach someone how to be a DM. I've done that before, and it's really valuable for them to talk with you about how you prep and then sit with you behind the DM screen during the game so that they can see how things go. That's one of the best ways to find out. And just do it, Be willing to try. And if you're going to be a DM for a group of players and you've never been a DM before, let them know that it's your first time. They'll cut you some slack and hopefully they'll have a great time. Maybe it might inspire someone else. So if you like this video, be sure to click the like button, subscribe to support the channel. And as always, have fun, stay cool, and keep your dice rolling.